I'm so excited to be here today to celebrate your 10th anniversary, and it was really wonderful to see Kelly. I was able to meet Kelly and Janet, and I don't know, several years ago. Oh my God, 9 years ago now in Boston, and it was really special to be able to connect with people, and I think that's kind of the theme I want to talk about today is just connections, and we're going to go through that a little bit as we go through my talk about what is MRKH. And I just thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to participate and share this special day with all of you. So this journey really starts shortly before this picture was taken many, many years ago. Um, and it really occurred when I was in my hospital bed. Um, I chose to have surgery to create a vagina, and when I did that, it was a 2-week recovery where I had to basically lay in a hospital bed for 2 weeks. And the thought that kept going through my head during that time was, how did this happen? How did, First of all, like, how do organs even develop? And what went wrong with mine? And this really has been a central theme, as sort of dictated my career and how I've chosen to spend a lot of my life. And it's really trying to understand how development happens and what's going on during those processes. And when you think about it, this quote from Esther Morris Leadoff, who is a leader in the field and is the first advocate for MRKH in the world, has this quote, and it's, "We all have different noses, different ears. Why wouldn't we have differences in our reproductive tract?" And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense because we're all different. We all have differences. Why wouldn't there be differences in our reproductive tracts? And so uterine development is like an orchestra. Each of these players in this orchestra is like the constellation of genes that are being turned on and turned off constantly in your cells. And sometimes, the tube is playing and sometimes it's not. And these genes have different functions and they all create different messages that create all of the organs, all of your cells, all of the tissues in your body. And when all goes well in uterine development, you start from this primordial biphasic organ that consists of both the Müllerian tissues, which can create the uterus, and the Wolffian ducts, which can create the male reproductive tracts. And what happens is there's some of the orchestra players turn on and turned off during early embryonic development. And if these orchestra players give instructions to make a female reproductive tract, what happens is these Müllerian ducts grow and these Wolffian ducts regress. And when it happens, these two Müllerian ducts fuse, and the dark red area is a cavity, and the pink area is a non-cavity part of the uterus. They fuse even more, and this intervening tissue here, it's called a septum, starts to be resorbed by the body, ultimately creating what looks like a typical uterus. So that's what happens during normal development or typical development. However, sometimes mistakes happen when orchestras are playing and a tuba plays the wrong note, or the chair of the woodwinds is gone and someone's replacing them. So it's always a different orchestra. And what I think is really important here is that to understand that uterine development occurs on a spectrum. We're typically told when we're diagnosed with MRKH, oh, this is a typical uterus and this is MRKH. But what they don't tell us is that there's an entire spectrum of uteruses that can develop in many different ways. And so while this is the diagrams we're given, this average diagram here, and MRKH, one of these two here, we're actually not so different from someone who has a eucarnate uterus, which is one of these Müllerian ducts didn't fuse with the other. Or you can see here, the Müllerian ducts started to fuse, but they still have the septum in here. So there are people walking around who look typical, look just like us, who may not have an average shaped uterus. They may have a T-shaped uterus or a septate uterus. And we just really don't know. But it's important to know that it's not just average and MRKH. There's an entire spectrum of people walking around with differences in their uterus. And so each of our cells has its own orchestra playing a different song. And so, as you can imagine, there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen in this. And when different songs are being played, you can get differences in your spine development that can lead to scoliosis. You can get differences in kidney development that can lead to someone having one kidney or a horseshoe kidney, or differences in their kidneys. You can have differences in the heart. You can have differences in the brain and other tissues. Some of us have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or hypermobility, where we have, we can bend our joints differently than most people. Some of us have Klippel-Feil syndrome, which is predominantly characterized by severe scoliosis and other sort of issues. So all of these orchestra players in our cells are causing slight differences that can also occur in our different tissues. And if you're one of the people who experience severe pain on a cyclical basis, there are some things to think about and some things to really talk to your doctor about. One of those could be potentially an ovarian cyst. And this happens when an egg's growing in your ovary and it doesn't release the way it typically does. And instead, this follicle keeps growing and growing and growing, and eventually it bursts. And it's an excruciatingly painful process that happens with all women, but it's something that can happen with MRKH. Another thing that can happen is endometriosis. And this is when small pieces of endometrial tissue inhabit places they're not supposed to. Maybe they're on the outside of your fallopian tubes. Maybe they're on your ovary, but they can also be found in your GI tract. They can even be found, I've read yesterday, in your sciatic nerve and can cause leg pain. So endometriosis is another possible cause if you have a lot of pain that's happening on a cyclical basis. And that's because as we release our hormones, and most of us have typical hormones with MRKH, the endometrial tissue responds to those hormones and kind of contracts, just as if you are maybe undergoing childbirth. And so it can be excruciatingly painful. And in fact, it turns out that studies done, 30, 40 years ago also show that endometrial tissue can arise even before anyone can develop an endometrial lining. And some of us may even have been born with endometrial tissue that you can have even if you never developed a uterus. And so these endometriosis can be an issue with people with MRKH, even if you don't have a uterus. So if my orchestra is unique to me, and I do want to put a trigger warning in here because we're going to talk about one of the most uncomfortable things that questions that have ever been asked in the MRKH community. But if my orchestra is unique to me, the question is, can I pass MRKH to my child? And your eggs contain your orchestra. Okay, so they contain all the genes that are involved in the orchestra, but each egg contains a different complement of these. So even though you have all of these people in the orchestra, they're all kind of goofed up and they're shuffled around. And so what happens is that most of the time the answer is probably not. And I know many people have been told by their physicians and their doctors that MRKH is just sporadic and it can't be passed on. However, within the last year, a paper was published by Dominal from out of Israel, showing that actually somebody with MRKH did have a child with MRKH. And since this time, at least two people who I know in person, or at least through support groups, have also had children with MRKH. So while it's not prevalent, and most people who have MRKH do not have children with MRKH, because we all have different orchestras, we all have different complements of these situations that are occurring in our eggs and our oocytes, that it is possible to pass on MRKH to our children. But we're so much more than just these orchestras. Whether or not I have MRKH or not, I'm a person. I have a vibrant career. I have a vibrant life. And, I feel like all of us are perfectly who we're supposed to be. We all have our unique noses, our ears, and everything else. All different parts of our body are really just, the way that we're supposed to be. And one of the things I just want to say is, how did this happen? And yeah, that's that same guy you took that picture with all those years ago. And, just trying to live a life and trying to live the best life I can have is really doing what I love has made all the difference. And really making the connections I've made across the world and across the country with other people with MRKH, and making sure that I'm not isolated, and really helping and being part of this community has made my life so much richer. And I encourage all of you to continue these connections that you've made here, to continue interacting with other people, because it really does make all the difference. And just congratulations, MRKH Connect. I'm so thankful to you for having me talk today, and I'm so excited to be here and be a part of your celebration.